You know, um, you know that feeling when you walk into a room
Oh, yeah.
and maybe it's like a crowded corporate boardroom or a really tense family gathering or even just a local community meeting. And you can instantly sense that the official organizational chart means absolutely nothing.
Right. It's just paper.
Exactly. You look at the person sitting at the head of the table, the one with the title or the gavel or whatever assumed authority they have, but your instincts are just screaming that they aren't the ones actually running the show.
It's a very specific kind of uh, atmospheric pressure, really. I mean, we've all felt it.
Oh, totally.
There's this invisible architecture of influence in the room, and if you can't read it, you're essentially flying blind. You might be pitching your heart out to the
All
CEO,
right.
completely unaware that CEO won't make a single decision without like a subtle nod from the quiet financial officer sitting over in the corner.
Yeah, and it's not even just about who holds the real power to approve things. It's also about who controls the emotional thermostat of the room.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Because you realize everyone is just walking on eggshells around that one middle manager who basically seems to dictate whether the team is going to have a productive day or a completely miserable one.
Yes.
So today, we're going to give you the X-ray vision required to see those hidden mechanics of group dynamics. We're going deep into the unspoken rules of power structures, conflict resolution, and just the undeniable gravitational pull of certain personalities.
It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. And we're doing it by examining a single, frankly, ruthless historical principle from our sources. The idea that if you strike the shepherd, the sheep will inevitably scatter.
It's a striking metaphor, and I think it gets right to the heart of human psychology. I mean, we love to believe in flat hierarchies.
Right, we do.
We comfort ourselves with this modern illusion that power in a group is shared equally, that everyone has an equal voice and that influence is perfectly democratized.
Because that sounds nice.
It sounds lovely, but the reality of human nature is that we inevitably congregate around one or two strong personalities. We operate like planets orbiting a sun.
Wow, yeah.
And when chronic trouble arises in a group, when there's constant friction or anxiety or division, it's rarely a collective systemic failure. Trouble can almost always be traced back to a single highly influential individual.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission for this deep dive is to help you, the listener, identify that real source of trouble in your own life. We're talking about the stirrer, the arrogant underling, the poisoner of goodwill.
Exactly.
We want to understand the historical and psychological methods used to neutralize these people, because if you allow them room to operate, their influence acts like a contagion. It spreads.
It really does. And the core philosophy we're exploring today is that you simply can't wait for the troubles these individuals cause to multiply.
Right.
And more importantly, you shouldn't try to negotiate with them. In the context of a specific group dynamic, certain types of troublemakers are practically irredeemable. Their power comes from creating division.
So you can't just talk it out.
No, the most effective solution is to neutralize their influence by isolating or banishing them entirely. You strike at the source, and the followers, who are honestly usually just reacting to the drama the leader creates, they'll scatter and return to a state of baseline calm.
I mean, it sounds incredibly intense and honestly a bit cutthroat.
It is.
To really understand how to handle these metaphorical shepherds, I think we need to look at a society that took this concept so seriously, they literally turned the act of neutralizing them into an annual citywide festival.
Yes, ancient Athens.
Right. We need to go back to 6th century BC Athens, because they had a very unique way of dealing with this.
Athens at this time was just a fascinating petri dish of human behavior. I mean, they had just overthrown a series of petty tyrants who had dominated their politics for decades.
Which was a huge deal.
A massive deal. And in the aftermath, they established a democracy, which was an incredible, fragile new experiment. It was their absolute proudest achievement. But this new civilized order created a completely novel problem that they had never faced before.
Right, because when you have a tyrant, the problem is obvious. It's the guy sitting on the throne with the army behind him.
Exactly.
But when you flatten the hierarchy and create a democracy, the threat changes shape entirely.
Right. They suddenly had to figure out how to deal with individuals who didn't care about the cohesion of this small city-state. Keep in mind, Athens was surrounded by enemies. Survival required unity.
Yeah.
But they were dealing with people who didn't work for the greater glory of Athens. They thought only of themselves, their own ambitions, their own petty intrigues.
Abstors.
Exactly. The Athenians realized that if they left these chronically selfish, charismatic people alone, they would inevitably sow dissension. They would divide the city into bitter factions and stir up constant anxiety.
Which would tear the whole thing apart.
Yes, all of which could easily lead to a civil war and the ruin of their brand new democracy.
And because they were a new democracy trying to project, like, an enlightened image, they couldn't just go around executing people they found annoying or ambitious.
Right. Violent political purges didn't really fit the brand they were going for.
Yeah, so they invented a completely new mechanism. They called it ostracism.
And the mechanics of it are just incredible. Once a year, the citizens would gather in the central marketplace. They would take a piece of earthenware, a broken shard of pottery called an ostracon,
Right.
and they would scratch into it the name of an individual they wanted to see banished from the city for 10 years.
Wait, 10 years? That is a massive portion of a person's lifespan back then.
Oh, absolutely.
And it wasn't for committing a crime. It was essentially the entire city voting you out just for being the most insufferable, disruptive person in town.
Yeah, and the process was incredibly systematic. If a particular name appeared on 6,000 ballots, that person was instantly exiled.
6,000.
6,000. There was no trial. There was no debate or defense allowed. It was just, the tribe has spoken. You have to leave immediately.
That is wild.
And this ritual expulsion became a highly anticipated festival. The citizens actually took joy in being able to surgically remove these irritating, anxiety-inducing individuals who constantly tried to elevate themselves above the collective group.
So let's look at who actually got voted off the island, so to speak, because this is where my modern sensibilities start to really short-circuit a bit.
Okay.
Because in 490 BC, you have Aristides. And this guy was a great general, like a legitimate war hero who helped defeat the Persians at the Battle of Marathon.
A huge figure.
Right. And off the battlefield, he was known as this incredibly fair, uncorrupted judge. People literally called him Aristides the Just.
They did, but as the years went by, the Athenian public started to deeply despise him.
Which is so crazy to me.
Well, that wasn't because he became corrupt. It was because he made such an insufferable public show of his righteousness.
Oh, I see.
The citizens started to feel that this constant suffocating display of morality was actually just a disguise. It was a mask for his own feelings of superiority and his thinly veiled scorn for the common, flawed folk around him.
Like he was just constantly looking down his nose at everyone.
Exactly. He was omnipresent in Athenian politics, constantly moralizing, and people just got sick of hearing him called the Just.
Right.
They feared that a man this judgmental and haughty would eventually stir up massive social divisions, alienating the working class from the elites.
So in 482 BC, even though they were still in a state of rolling conflict with the Persians, they could have desperately used his military expertise. They collected the ostraca and banished him.
They did. And, nature abhors a vacuum. With Aristides gone, another great general named Themistocles filled that void.
Right.
He became the city's premier leader and a massive war hero in his own right. But he fell into a completely different psychological trap.
What did he do?
His victories went to his head. He became wildly arrogant and overbearing. He was constantly reminding the Athenians of all the battles he had won for them and all the dangers he had fended off.
Oh, he was one of those guys. You'd be nothing without me.
Precisely.
No.
He even built a temple to the goddess Artemis and styled her as wisest in council.
Okay, sure.
Which to the Athenians was a very thinly veiled hint that he was actually the one who gave the wisest counsel to Athens.
Oh, wow.
And he had the audacity to build this temple right next to his own house.
No way.
Yes, he was basically erecting a billboard that said, without me, you people would be completely ruined.
Which is exactly the kind of asocial behavior the Athenians feared most, right?
Absolutely. A leader acting like a god creates a toxic dependency and breeds deep resentment. So in 472 BC, the pottery shards were filled out again, and Themistocles was exiled to rid the city of his poisonous presence.
And it wasn't just generals, right?
No, we see the exact same pattern with Damon, who was the tutor of the great statesman Pericles. Damon was undeniably brilliant, a master of music and rhetoric, but he suffered ostracism simply because of his superior airs and his insulting, condescending manner toward everyday citizens.
Okay, I have to push back on this Athenian concept, though. I'm struggling to see how this is a sound survival strategy.
How so?
Well, if you're a city-state constantly at war and you decide to banish your smartest general, your fairest judge, and your brightest teacher just because their personality is great on people, aren't you just crippling yourself?
It seems that way, yeah.
Like, how does throwing away your highest performers not get you conquered immediately?
That's a vital distinction to make.
Yeah.
The Athenians weren't kicking them out because they were high performers. They were removing them for the toxic externalities of their behavior.
Okay.
It was a harsh cost-benefit analysis. A brilliant general who breeds deep systemic resentment and divides the city into warring political factions is ultimately a greater threat to the survival of the state than a mediocre general who maintains national unity.
Oh, I see.
It was about neutralizing a social behavior that threatened the democratic spirit. If a leader makes the common citizen feel inherently inferior or prioritizes their own ambition over the common good, they slowly eat away at the very cohesion that keeps the society functioning.
So it's less about punishing a crime and more about, like, prophylactic societal health care.
Exactly.
It reminds me of a dynamic you see in modern corporate environments all the time with the quote-unquote rock star employee.
Oh yes, the rock star.
Right. You have someone who crushes all their sales targets, they're undeniably brilliant at coding or whatever their specific task is, but their toxic, arrogant attitude completely destroys the psychological safety of the rest of the team.
Oh, I've all worked with one.
Yeah, and eventually a good manager has to look at the math and realize that keeping the rock star is actually costing the company more in lost team morale, burnout, and turnover than the individual is bringing in revenue. You have to fire the rock star to save the team.
That's a phenomenal modern parallel. And the historical argument here is that the ancient Athenians had highly attuned social instincts that we've largely lost in the modern era.
Really? You think we've lost them?
I do. The passage of centuries has blunted our ability to swiftly and decisively deal with these disruptive individuals. Today, our first instinct is almost always to try to rehabilitate the rockstar employee.
Yeah, that's true.
We try to absorb their behavior, we send them to HR workshops, we try to reason with them, or we awkwardly negotiate around their ego.
Which usually just signals to them that they are, in fact, untouchable.
Precisely. Trying to reform them or appease them is a fatal miscalculation. It only emboldens them and makes the group dynamic worse.
Right.
Furthermore, attacking them directly but ineffectively is just as dangerous, because these individuals are often highly charismatic and deeply entrenched. If you wound them without removing them, they'll just work underground to destroy you through gossip and sabotage.
So you have to remove them completely.
The Athenian solution was brutal but effective. Surgically separate them from the group before they become the eye of a whirlpool that drags everyone else down.
But the Athenian system wasn't foolproof, was it? Because the practice of ostracism actually fell apart. And the way it ended is a perfect example of what happens when a system of power is hijacked by the wrong people.
Yeah, the end of ostracism is quite a story. In 417 BC, there was a man named Hyperbolus.
Great name.
Right. Writers of the time considered him the city's most worthless citizen. He was a sleazy slanderer, a terminal obnoxious presence who contributed nothing but noise.
Okay, so just a troll, basically.
A complete troll. And he saw an opportunity to weaponize the ostracism festival to stir up anger against the two leading politicians of the time, Alcibiades and Nicias.
Now, Alcibiades had this flamboyant, almost scandalous lifestyle that rubbed traditionalists the wrong way, right?
He did.
And Nicias was incredibly wealthy, conservative, and aloof. So Hyperbolus figures, great, the city is divided. They'll definitely ostracize one of these two powerful guys, and I'll just casually step right into the massive power vacuum they leave behind.
It was a sneaky plan.
Yeah.
But Alcibiades and Nicias, even though they were bitter political rivals who despised each other, were also incredibly shrewd.
They saw right through it.
They realized exactly what Hyperbolus was trying to do. So instead of fighting each other, they secretly pooled their resources. They directed their respective factions to vote together, and they managed to turn the entire ostracism vote onto Hyperbolus instead.
That is hilarious. They essentially formed a one-day alliance just to say, this guy is a low buffoon, let's just get rid of him.
Exactly. And they did. He got the 6,000 votes.
Wow.
But because Hyperbolus wasn't a great, formidable man like Aristides or Themistocles because he was just a petty nuisance, the Athenians felt the entire ritual of ostracism had been completely degraded.
Oh, because it wasn't about saving the state from a titan anymore.
Right. It had been reduced from a mechanism for saving the state to a petty political prank. It lost its gravitas. And they ended a practice that had successfully kept the peace for nearly 100 years.
That is such a fascinating backfire, because ostracism worked because everyone in the society agreed to the rules, The entire city was the enforcement mechanism.
Yes.
But what do you do when you don't have a voting populace behind you? What if you're an outsider looking at an enemy fortress and you can't exactly ask them to vote their leader out?
Then you have to get creative.
Right. You have to find a way to lure the shepherd away using pure psychological deception.
And that brings us to a brilliant and, frankly, terrifying historical example of institutional isolation. We're shifting our focus to Rome in the year 1296.
Okay, set and scene.
The cardinals of the Catholic Church had just selected a new pope, Cardinal Gaetani, who took the name Boniface VIII.
And Boniface was not like a gentle spiritual leader.
Not at all.
He was a shrewd, ruthless political plotter who stopped at absolutely nothing to get his way. He quickly crushed his rivals within the church, unified the papal states under his iron grip, and had the monarchs of Europe completely intimidated.
He was a powerhouse.
But there was one massive piece of the geopolitical puzzle he didn't have, which was Tuscany. It was the richest, most culturally vibrant part of Italy. And to control Tuscany, he had to control its crown jewel, the wildly wealthy Republic of Florence.
The problem for Boniface was that Florence was fiercely independent. However, it was also deeply divided by a bitter internal feud between two factions, the whites and the blacks.
Okay, so a built-in vulnerability.
Exactly. The whites were the new merchant families. They had recently acquired massive commercial wealth and currently held political power in the city. The blacks represented the older aristocratic money, and they deeply, violently resented the whites for usurping their traditional authority.
So Boniface looks at this boiling pot of civil division and sees a massive opportunity. He decides to secretly ally with the blacks to help them violently take over the city.
Right, a classic proxy war.
In exchange, the blacks will essentially put Florence in his pocket. But as Boniface studies the board, he realizes the whites have a major asset, a shepherd. They have Dante Alighieri.
Yes, the celebrated writer, poet, and philosopher.
The guy who wrote the Inferno.
The very same.
Yeah.
But Dante wasn't just an artist. He was a passionate believer in the Florentine Republic. He was an incredibly eloquent public speaker, and he served as a prior one of the city's highest elected executive officials.
Wow, I didn't realize he was so politically involved.
Oh, he was central to it. Dante wasn't just a politician. He was the ideological and moral anchor of the white faction. He was the one firmly resisting all of the Pope's subtle attempts to sow disorder. Boniface realized that by hook or by crook, he had to neutralize Dante.
And the trap he sets is just a masterclass in psychological manipulation.
It really is.
In 1301, Boniface calls in a French prince, Charles de Valois, to march his army through northern Italy and physically threaten Florence.
Just massive intimidation.
Yeah, so Florence is in a state of sheer panic. The French army is looming. Dante is out in the squares, rallying the citizens, organizing the local resistance, and giving these soaring, eloquent speeches about defending the Republic and refusing to appease the Pope.
So Boniface plays the oldest card in the geopolitical playbook. While he's openly threatening Florence with a foreign army on one hand, he suddenly holds out a diplomatic olive branch with the other.
Classic.
He offers the possibility of peace negotiations in Rome. He knows Florence is desperate to avoid a war and will want to send a delegation. And he knows, with absolute certainty, that because Dante is their most eloquent speaker and their fiercest defender, Florence will inevitably send him to lead that delegation.
I mean, it's an obvious trap. People in Florence actually warned Dante not to go.
They did.
But Dante's own ego and his genuine belief in the power of reason worked against him. He truly believed his eloquence and his moral arguments could actually win the Pope over.
Which was incredibly naive.
Extremely. Because the moment Dante and the delegates arrive in the Vatican, Boniface completely drops the polite diplomatic act.
The mask comes off.
He bellows at them, "Fall on your knees before me, submit to me." He subjects them to intense psychological intimidation, making it clear they are entirely at his mercy.
And after utterly terrifying them, Boniface executes a sudden pivot. He softens his tone. He promises to look after Florence's interests and advises the terrified delegation to return home to share the good news.
Oh, wow.
But he insists they leave just one member behind in Rome to finalize the treaty details. And, predictably, he politely, but with the implicit threat of absolute power, orders that Dante must be the one to stay.
So he frames it as a great honor, a diplomatic necessity, but it was essentially a hostage situation.
It was a soft kidnapping, really.
Yeah. Dante is physically trapped in Rome, and while he's stuck there, engaged in these endless, circular, utterly pointless dialogues with the Pope's bureaucrats, Florence completely falls apart without him.
We have to look at the psychological mechanism of how Dante's abscess broke the whites. It wasn't just that they lost a vote in the council.
Right.
Dante was the charisma, the willpower, and the moral compass, keeping a very fragile coalition together. The historical principle here is that one resolute person, one truly disobedient spirit, can give a flock of sheep the courage of lions.
I love that phrase.
It's powerful. When you remove that anchor, individuals stop fighting for the collective ideal and start worrying about their own immediate survival. With Dante physically isolated in Rome, the Pope's agents began funneling money to Charles de Valois, who used it to bribe the secondary leaders of the whites.
Because there's no one there to hold them accountable.
Exactly. Without Dante there to shame them or rally them, their greed and fear took over. The whites disintegrated into arguing, paralyzed subfactions.
And the blacks, seeing their enemy totally leaderless and divided, easily swept in. They destroyed the whites within weeks.
Just completely overran them.
They took over the city government, exacted violent revenge, burned down houses, and secured the city for the Pope. And then, only when the blacks were firmly and violently in power, did the Pope finally dismiss Dante from Rome. Like, negotiations are over, you can go home now.
And the tragedy of Dante's fate is profound.
It really is.
Because the newly installed black government ordered him to return to face a sham trial for corruption. When he wisely refused, they condemned him to be burned to death if he ever set foot in Florence again.
Oh my gosh.
He spent the rest of his life wandering Italy in bitter exile, which, ironically, is when he wrote the Divine Comedy.
So we got a masterpiece out of it, but at a terrible personal cost.
Yes. Boniface had conquered one of the richest, most heavily fortified cities in Europe without a protracted siege. He won it entirely through the psychological and physical isolation of the enemy's single key figure.
Here's where it gets really interesting because it's such a dark, brilliant strategy, but it reminds me of like a sports coach calling a fake timeout.
A fake timeout.
Yeah, imagine you're playing against a basketball team that has one absolute superstar player who is carrying all the momentum, hitting every shot, making everyone else on the floor better.
Okay, I see where you're going.
You can't stop the whole team, so you call a timeout, maybe have an assistant coach argue with the referee. You do whatever it takes to disrupt the flow and get that star player distracted or off the floor for just one crucial possession.
Right.
While the star is sidelined, you run your trick play against the suddenly confused, leaderless defense, and you score.
That captures the essence of it perfectly. Boniface didn't waste resources attacking the whole white faction. He lured the star player off the court.
Exactly.
A core lesson here is that you should never waste your time or energy lashing out in all directions at what seems to be a massive, many-headed enemy. It's exhausting and usually ineffective.
You're just swatting at flies.
Right. You have to locate the one head that actually matters. It might be the person with the strongest willpower, the sharpest strategic mind, or, most importantly, the one with the charisma that binds everyone else together.
And you just lure them away, which, if you look closely, is a dynamic you see deployed in modern corporate workplaces all the time.
Well, constantly.
Think about your own lives for a second. Have you ever noticed how sometimes a highly effective but highly critical employee, maybe someone who is organizing the staff against a terrible new management policy, suddenly gets promoted to lead a special task force?
Yes.
Or they get assigned to a highly prestigious long-term research project that conveniently requires them to work out of a different building across town.
Ah, yes, the classic promotion to nowhere. It's an incredibly common institutional tactic.
Because they can't just fire them.
Exactly. Management knows they can't fire the individual because that would
Negative.
create a martyr, validate the employee's criticisms, and likely cause a staff revolt. Instead, they honor them.
Just like Boniface.
Just like Boniface handed Dante a prestigious diplomatic mission. But the end result is exactly the same. The individual is physically and psychologically isolated from their power base.
Wow.
Without their daily presence, their casual conversations by the coffee machine, and their immediate influence, the resistance they were organizing quietly loses momentum and evaporates.
It's so insidious, but it works. So we've explored how shepherds can be removed through democratic votes, and we've seen them lured away through diplomatic trickery. But what happens when the shepherd is so powerful that their removal causes an entire civilization to instantly collapse?
This moves us from tricking a political opponent to destroying an empire. We can call this the Keystone Effect.
The Keystone Effect.
Yes. The historical accounts of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, particularly William H. Prescott's 1847 excerpt on the conquest of Peru, detail how conquerors like Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro managed to topple vast, heavily armed empires with only a tiny fraction of the troops they were facing.
Yeah, let's talk about Pizarro. He had, what, maybe a couple hundred men?
About 160.
160 men. And he was walking into an empire of millions, defended by tens of thousands of hardened warriors. They didn't fight on multiple fronts. They didn't try to go toe-to-toe in a war of attrition against those massive numbers.
So that would have been suicide.
Right. They focused their entire strategy on capturing the leaders. Moctezuma of the Aztecs for Cortez, and in Pizarro's case, Atahualpa of the Incas.
To understand why this worked, we have to understand Atahualpa's position in Incan society. He wasn't just a political ruler or a top general. He was reverenced as a literal living god.
The ultimate authority.
Yes, he was the head of state, the head of the religion, the ultimate judge, and the commander-in-chief. Every single institution, every law, every social custom converged upon his physical person. Prescott famously describes him as the keystone of the political fabric.
And a keystone, just to visualize it for everyone, is that central wedge-shaped stone placed right at the very top, the apex of an architectural arch. It's the final piece dropped into place that locks all the other stones into position and allows the entire arch to bear massive amounts of weight. If you pull that one single stone out, the surrounding stones don't just weaken. The entire structure catastrophically collapses under its own weight in seconds.
And that catastrophic collapse is precisely what played out in the Andes. The historical accounts describe this incredibly tense, terrifying moment during the ambush at Cajamarca.
Oh, this scene is unbelievable.
It really is. The Spanish forces, heavily outnumbered and frankly terrified, ignored the thousands of Incan warriors surrounding the plaza. They drove straight for the royal litter carrying Atahualpa.
Just a laser focus on the leader.
Exactly. They violently fought their way through the unarmed nobles who were desperately using their own bodies to shield their god king. The Spanish literally grabbed Atahualpa, dragged him from the litter, and snatched the imperial symbol, the borla, right off his temples, taking him hostage.
And it's the immediate visceral reaction of the massive Incan army that is so fascinating here.
Yes, their reaction is everything.
They had thousands of warriors right there. They could have easily overwhelmed the tiny Spanish force. But the psychological shock of seeing their god physically manhandled and captured completely broke their reality.
It shattered their worldview.
The historical record notes that the moment Atahualpa was captured, the invisible charm that held the entire Peruvian society together just dissolved. The army didn't counterattack. Every man suddenly thought only of his own individual survival. They completely panicked, broke ranks, and scattered in every direction into the night.
Because with the leader gone, their entire center of gravity vanished. The capture of Atahualpa didn't just leave a temporarily vacant throne. It announced to the entire civilization that their foundational reality had been shattered.
Yeah.
By identifying and striking the absolute center of power, a laughably tiny force was able to scatter and ultimately conquer a massive, highly organized empire.
It's the brutal reality of Aesop's fables playing out on a world stage.
Oh, which fable are you thinking of?
There's a specific fable about the wolves and the sheep that perfectly illustrates this mechanic. The wolves want nothing more than to devour the flock of sheep, but they can't get past the fierce dogs that guard them.
Okay, yes.
So the wolves try diplomacy. They send an embassy to the sheep and say, we wouldn't have to be in this constant state of stressful warfare if it weren't for those aggressive, barking dogs you keep around. They're the ones provoking us. Send the dogs away, and we can all live in eternal peace and harmony.
And the sheep fall for it.
They do. The sheep, desperate for peace and totally lacking strategic foresight, actually listen. They voluntarily dismiss their protectors, removing their own keystone, and the very next day they become easy prey to the wolves.
That is painfully accurate. Whether it's an Incan god king or the guard dogs of a flock, the underlying principle is identical. A predator or an enemy will always try to convince you to voluntarily surrender your center of strength.
So what does this all mean for the listener? We're talking about Spanish conquerors and fables about wolves, but this exact same dynamic happens on a micro level in our personal lives all the time.
How so?
Think about your own social circle. Almost every long-term friend group has what I call the glue friend.
Oh, yes. The glue friend.
This is the person who inevitably organizes the dinners, the one who initiates the group texts, the one whose living room you always end up sitting in on a Friday night. If that glue friend gets a new job and moves to a different city, what happens to the group?
More often than not, The whole friend group just slowly stops hanging out.
Exactly.
You might meet up once or twice, but eventually it fades. You realize that you weren't actually a tightly knit web of equal friendships. You were all just individual planets orbiting that one specific sun. Without their social energy providing a center of gravity, there's nothing pulling the group together, and everyone just naturally drifts apart.
It's sad, but it's true. And this keystone concept isn't just about identifying positive leaders or social glue. It's also a powerful tool for diagnosing the root cause of deep dysfunction.
Yes, there's a fascinating application of this in the world of psychology.
Right, Dr.
And
Erickson.
a renowned family therapist, Dr. Milton H. Erickson, he used this exact principle to treat severely unsettled, dysfunctional families. When a family came into his office completely paralyzed by constant bickering and chaos, Erickson knew that the dysfunction wasn't equally distributed.
It wasn't just everybody being awful.
No, there was inevitably one specific person who was the primary stirrer, the quiet instigator of the chaos.
So how did he figure out who it was?
Well, what made Erickson's approach so brilliant was how he bypassed arguing over the details of their fights and instead made the invisible power dynamics physically visible in the room. During a therapy session, he would just observe the micro-interactions.
Just watching them.
Yes. And once he identified the rotten apple, the one subtly antagonizing the others, he wouldn't confront them verbally. He would simply ask that person to physically move their chair a few feet away from the rest of the family, isolating them from the physical circle.
Wait, he just moved their chair?
He literally just asked them to move their chair back.
That is wild. I mean, it seems so simple.
It is simple, but that tiny introduction of physical space changed the entire psychological ecosystem of the room.
Because they couldn't hide anymore, right?
It was profoundly effective because stirrers thrive by hiding in the dense cover of the group. They disguise their actions by blending them into the reactions of others.
Right, like starting a fire and then hiding in the smoke.
Exactly. In a family setting, the stirrer might subtly kick their sibling under the table. When the sibling suddenly yells out in anger, the parents scold the sibling while the stirrer sits there looking perfectly innocent.
Such classic sibling behavior.
But by physically separating that person from the cluster, Erickson stripped away their camouflage. Their actions were suddenly observable in a vacuum. Slowly, the rest of the family would look at this physically separated person, watch how they tried to manipulate the conversation from afar, and the collective realization would dawn on them. Oh, you are the actual source of our constant difficulty.
You take away their cover, and their power vanishes. There's a powerful metaphor used to describe this approach in the text. Cancer begins with a single cell. Excise it before it spreads.
It's a harsh way to look at it, but accurate.
You have to recognize who is actually controlling the group dynamic before their behavior infects everyone else. I want to cite the 8th century Chinese poet Tu Fu here because he captures this perfectly. He wrote, "To shoot a rider, first shoot his horse. To catch a gang of bandits, first capture its leader."
Yes.
Stop exhausting yourself fighting the endless symptoms of a problem and go straight for the root cause.
Now, we've talked extensively about what happens when you actively push a leader out, or trick them into leaving, or physically remove them. But what about when the leader accidentally locks themselves out?
Oh, this is a great point.
Sometimes you don't have to lift a finger to neutralize a powerful person. Sometimes individuals in power do all the heavy lifting for you by voluntarily isolating themselves.
This brings us to a really fascinating vulnerability: the danger of absence. We often think of isolation as a weapon you use against your enemies, but it's equally a trap you can stumble into yourself if you aren't incredibly careful.
It happens all the time.
It's a cliche for a reason. Powerful people often let success go to their heads. They start to believe their own hype, they surround themselves with sycophants, and they slowly alienate themselves from the ordinary people who make up their base of support.
They lose touch.
Exactly. They lose the simple knack for communicating with the very flock they are supposed to be leading.
And that self-inflicted isolation makes them incredibly fragile. One of the most striking historical examples of this vulnerability being exploited is the story of the mystic monk Rasputin and his unbelievable rise to supreme power over the Romanov dynasty in Russia.
Such a crazy story.
Rasputin didn't have to devise some complex Machiavellian plot to isolate Tsarina Alexandra from the Russian government or the people. She had already done that to herself. She was deeply, tragically isolated long before he ever arrived at the palace.
Because she was a German princess who married into the Russian monarchy.
That's exactly.
She was a foreigner who never fully understood the culture of the everyday Russian people, and the Russian aristocracy openly disliked her.
They resented her immensely.
She was sitting in an opulent, gilded palace, absolutely desperate to connect with her subjects, but completely and totally cut off from the brutal reality of the country she was ruling.
And Rasputin, an illiterate peasant from Siberia, looked at the political board, saw this massive, gaping void around the Tsarina, and just stepped right into it.
He didn't even need to force his way in.
He didn't use an army. He used her own profound loneliness. He used his peasant origins and his mystical aura to present himself as the authentic voice of the Russian soil. He convinced her that he was the sole divine bridge between her isolated palace and the soul of the Russian people.
Wow.
Because she was so completely starved for connection and fearful for her sick son, she clung to him like a life raft. He made himself the only person she truly trusted. And through her, because she heavily dominated her husband, the Tsar Rasputin essentially gained backdoor control over the entire Russian Empire.
It just shows that when a leader isolates themselves like that, they become incredibly susceptible to manipulation. If you find someone who holds a high, powerful position but has no real allies and is totally isolated from the ground truth of their organization, they are highly vulnerable to anyone who promises to bridge that gap.
Absolutely. We also see the strategic use of space and presence, or the lack thereof, played out brilliantly in the royal court of Queen Elizabeth IV.
Oh, this is a great example.
Her prime minister, Robert Cecil, was a master of managing his rivals. He had two main competitors vying for the Queen's favor and attention: the highly charismatic Earl of Essex and the famous explorer Sir Walter Raleigh.
Two huge personalities.
Massive egos. Cecil knew that if he tried to attack them directly in the daily life of the court, where they are both incredibly popular and charming, he would likely lose. Instead, he used their own ambitions against them.
What did he do?
He continually contrived to have them appointed to prestigious, dangerous military missions against Spain.
He basically manipulated the Queen into deploying his biggest rivals on overseas combat missions.
He handed them glory, but the real prize was getting them out of the building.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And while Essex and Raleigh were hundreds of miles away, battling storms and the Spanish Navy, absent from the daily rhythms of the court, Cecil was physically present.
Just constantly hovering around the Queen.
He wrapped his influence around her. He was the one bringing her the daily news, whispering in her ear, and framing the narrative of what was happening. Over months and years, he systematically weakened her affection for Raleigh and Essex, replacing their influence with his own solid, dependable presence.
It's the ultimate high-stakes version of the old saying. There's a vital twofold lesson here, right? First, quietly luring your enemies away from the center of action during critical moments is a highly effective, low-risk ploy.
Yes.
But second, and far more importantly, for your own self-preservation, your own absence from the scene, especially during a time of flux or turmoil, spells absolute danger.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, presence is an absolute prerequisite for maintaining power and influence. Charm, authority, and alliances require constant maintenance. If you're physically or mentally out of sight, your charm naturally wears off, your influence wanes, and your absence creates a vacuum that someone else will inevitably fill.
Think about this in the context of our modern work environment, especially with the rise of remote work or how people manage their paid time off. Let's say your company announces a major restructuring, or there are quiet rumors of layoffs coming down the pipeline.
Always a stressful time.
Right. If you decide that this period of corporate anxiety is the perfect time to finally take that disconnected 3-week backpacking trip through Europe, you are essentially Sir Walter Raleigh getting on a boat to Spain.
You really are.
If you aren't physically or virtually present in the room where the decisions are being made, where the alliances are shifting, someone else is going to step in and take your desk, either literally or metaphorically.
It's a profound vulnerability.
Yeah.
And this tactic of deliberately creating isolation is also the primary foundational tool of con artists and cult leaders.
Oh, that's so true.
If you study how confidence tricks work, the grifter always looks for ways to physically or psychologically isolate their mark from their normal social environment. They will steer the victim into new, unfamiliar, or uncomfortable environments where the mark feels out of their depth and disconnected from their usual reality checks.
Like they get you out of your hometown, or they insist you keep an investment opportunity a secret from your family and friends.
Exactly. Don't tell anyone until it's finalized.
Because they know that if you tell your sensible best friend what's happening, your friend will immediately say, hey, this is an obvious scam, don't give them your money. Once you are isolated in a new environment without your trusted support network, your critical thinking skills plummet, and you succumb to deception much more easily.
It's entirely about shrinking the victim's support base. We see this elevated to a terrifying statecraft with Mao Zedong's strategy of stealthy isolation.
Stealthy isolation, what does that look like?
Well, when Mao wanted to eliminate a powerful political enemy within the ruling elite, he rarely confronted them directly in a fiery public showdown.
Yeah.
That would cause a messy, unpredictable conflict and force people to choose sides.
All right, too risky.
Instead, he worked silently and invisibly to isolate the target. He would slowly turn the man's allies against him, quietly reassigning the target's supporters and shrinking his power base behind the scenes.
Just gradually eroding their foundation.
Eventually, the target would look around and realize he had absolutely no one left to defend him. He would just vanish from the political landscape on his own, collapsing because his entire foundation had been secretly hollowed out.
It's chillingly effective. But I think we need to pump the brakes for a second and issue a serious warning to everyone listening.
A warning?
Yeah, because we've been analyzing these historical events, and it can make this principle sound almost like a neat, foolproof math equation. Like, find the leader, isolate them, and you automatically win the game. But what happens if you try to strike the shepherd and you miss? What happens if, instead of scattering in fear, the flock turns into a highly organized pack of wolves?
This is the crucial turning point in our analysis, and it brings us to what we might call the reversal. There is a massive, very real danger if you botch the isolation attempt. The Renaissance philosopher Machiavelli wrote a famous, chilling warning about exactly this dynamic.
What did he say?
He wrote, "Any harm you do to a man should be done in such a way that you need not fear his revenge."
Okay, essentially, if you are going to take a swing at isolating a powerful enemy, you better make absolutely sure you completely destroy their ability to ever repay the favor. You can't just wound them.
Precisely. You must apply this principle from a position of absolute superiority. If you don't actually have the institutional power or the leverage to truly permanently neutralize them, a half-baked partial isolation is the worst thing you can do.
Because it just tips your hand.
It doesn't solve your problem. It just creates a highly motivated, incredibly angry enemy who now knows exactly what you're trying to do.
And the historical example of this backfiring is just wild. It involves the period right after the American Civil War. President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, decided that his wildly popular commanding general, Ulysses S. Grant, was becoming a massive political headache.
Yes.
Grant disagreed with Johnson's policies, so Johnson decided to use the isolation playbook. He tried to marginalize Grant, publicly undermining him as a prelude to forcing him out of the government entirely.
But Johnson made a fatal miscalculation.
A huge one.
He did not possess absolute superiority over a man as universally beloved and politically resourceful as Ulysses S. Grant. Johnson's attempts at isolation didn't neutralize Grant, they just deeply insulted and enraged him.
Right, you don't do that to a general who just won a war.
No, you do not. Realizing what the president was doing, Grant went on the offensive. He completely bypassed Johnson, went directly to the radical wing of the Republican Party, formed a massive, unstoppable political support base, and rode that wave of public resentment all the way to the White House. He became the next president of the United States.
He literally took the job of the guy who tried to isolate him. It's exactly like swatting at a hornet's nest with a rolled-up newspaper and completely missing the hornet.
Exactly.
You didn't neutralize the threat in the slightest. You just loudly announced that you are a hostile enemy, and now a very angry hornet is flying straight for your face.
That is exactly the risk of attempting to strike a shepherd when you don't hold enough power. So what do you do when you are faced with a powerful stirrer or a disruptive leader, but you know you lack the absolute superiority required to banish them?
What's the alternative?
The strategic alternative is counterintuitive. Instead of isolating them and risking their revenge, you keep them incredibly close. You keep them inside the fold.
It's the old adage, right? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But we usually say that without really thinking about the mechanics of why keeping an enemy close is beneficial.
Right. You keep them close for a highly specific operational purpose. If they're banished to the fringes but still have some power, they are invisible to you.
You can't see what they're plotting.
By keeping them close, putting them on your committee, inviting them to the meetings, managing them directly, you can watch them. You monitor their actions, you understand their grievances, and most importantly, you can secretly and slowly whittle away at their support base.
Ah, stealthy isolation again.
Exactly. You execute the quiet, stealthy work of hollowing out their foundation from the inside so that later, when you finally do have the leverage to cut them loose, they fall fast and hard. They won't have a base left to launch a revenge attack from.
I see this exact scenario play out constantly in delicate office politics. Let's say you're a mid-level manager and you have a really difficult, scheming employee who is constantly undermining your authority.
Yes.
Your first emotional instinct is just to get them out of your sight. You want to transfer them to a different department on the other side of the building just to get them out of your hair so you don't have to deal with them every day.
But if you succumb to that instinct without actually firing them, you've made a terrible strategic error.
Because now they're out of your sight.
Right. They are now operating completely unmonitored. They can scheme against you, spread vicious rumors, and build toxic alliances with other department heads, and you have absolutely zero visibility into what they're doing until it's too late.
Exactly. So sometimes it's actually much safer, though admittedly more stressful in the short term, to keep that difficult person on your immediate team sitting at a desk right outside your office door.
Keep them contained.
You manage them closely, you document every single interaction, you give them specific tasks that limit their ability to network, and you slowly, methodically ensure they don't gain unchecked influence over the rest of your junior staff. You neutralize their poison by proximity and containment rather than by distance.
It's entirely about controlling the variables. Whether you have the power to banish them to the wilderness, like Dante, or you have to keep them trapped in the room with you, the ultimate goal of the strategy is exactly the same. You must sever their unchecked connection to the rest of the flock.
Wow. We have covered some seriously massive ground today. We've traveled from the dusty pottery shards of ancient Athenian marketplaces to the psychological torture chambers of medieval popes.
We certainly have.
We've dissected the catastrophic collapse of the Incan Empire in an afternoon, and we've looked at the subtle, brilliant, chair-moving maneuvers of a 20th century family therapist.
And yet, through all of these vastly diverse historical environments and scales of human interaction, the common thread remains remarkably, almost terrifyingly consistent.
Yeah.
Power is never truly flat. Trouble always has a specific source. Human beings, whether they are marching in an army or sitting around a dinner table, will always organize themselves around a center of gravity.
So as you go back into your own life this week, whether you're heading into a high-stakes corporate meeting, dealing with a fractured community organization, or just trying to navigate the complex dynamics of your own family or friend group, I challenge you to look at your environment through this new X-ray lens.
That's a great challenge.
When conflict arises, stop wasting your emotional energy swatting at the many-headed enemy. Stop trying to cure every single little symptom of dysfunction. Take a deep breath, step back, look at the invisible architecture of the room, and identify the keystone. Find the shepherd.
Yes.
And once you find them, you have a critical decision to make. Do you have the superiority to safely isolate and banish them, or do you need to pull them close and manage them?
But before we officially wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, slightly unsettling thought to mull over.
Okay, lay it on us.
We spent this entire time analyzing how to spot and strategically neutralize the shepherd in order to save the flock. But if human psychology insists that people will always congregate around a single, strong personality, once you successfully remove the current shepherd, aren't you merely creating a massive power vacuum?
Oh, wow.
And doesn't that vacuum practically guarantee that a new, potentially much cursed shepherd will rise to take their place?
Oh.
Or even more dangerously, by orchestrating the downfall of the shepherd, do you inevitably become the very thing you just destroyed?
That is a heavy, fascinating question to take with you. The next time you walk into a crowded room and use your new X-ray vision to quietly read those unspoken power dynamics, just remember, someone else in that room might be looking right back, trying to read you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden currents of power. We'll catch you next time.